Welcome, everybody, to the Does the Patriarchy Still Exist debate here on the Verbum YouTube channel. My name is Mason, and I'll be your moderator. Today, debating the patriarchy, we have Marielle and Josh. So, you guys can introduce yourselves and start your opening statements now.
It's Jake, actually. Just want to be clear on that.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Right.
No worries.
Well, I can go first. So, hi everyone. I am Marielle. I am debating the affirmative that it does exist. So, a patriarchy is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it, or by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as where men hold a disproportionately large share of power in a society. While it is true that the American government is not an enforced patriarchy, there are no laws, at least today, that still exist or are enforced that specifically exclude women from power. However, the patriarchy is still very much a part of American society. The patriarchy creates a society where positions of authority are reserved for men, and it creates a power imbalance between men and women. As I said before, this is not enforced by any laws. However, up until the late 20th century, it was. For example, until the Equal Credit Act of 1974, unmarried women were regularly denied credit cards, and married women had to get their husbands to co-sign. However, obviously, laws like this no longer exist. But many state legislatures still impose restrictions on women that are not imposed on men. For example, multiple states regulate women's access to birth control and sterilization procedures. However, they do not try to regulate men's access to vasectomies. Looking outside the legal remnants of the patriarchy, it is still incredibly prevalent in American society. For example, according to the Pew Research Center, 42% of women have experienced workplace discrimination based on their gender, and women are 3 times more likely to report workplace sexual harassment, and 54% of women say they have experienced unwanted sexual advances. According to the American Economic Association, 50% of women in the economics field have experienced discrimination based on their gender compared to only 3% of men. In positions of power, women account for only 20% of Congress and 25% of state legislatures, despite making up 50% of the population. A study done by Northwestern University found that male Supreme Court justices were 3 times more likely to interrupt their female colleagues than male colleagues. And a study done by George Washington University found that men were 33% more likely to interrupt their female colleagues than their male colleagues in general. In 2018, women made up only 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs, and according to the ILO, as of 2009, only 24% of CEOs in total were women, and they earned on average 74.5% of what male CEOs made. All of these statistics point to a clear power imbalance between men and women in American society, which is the defining characteristic of a patriarchy. This power imbalance is reinforced by gender norms that are pushed on children from a young age, where boys are taught that crying is synonymous with weakness, and girls are taught that assertiveness equals aggression. These ideas are present throughout society, where female politicians are called power hungry and aggressive in situations where male politicians would not be. While there are fields where women are overrepresented in the workforce, such as in healthcare, social services, and education, they are underrepresented in STEM fields, politics, and business. According to the Pew Research Center, this is because 44% of Americans say girls are discouraged from pursuing these careers, are instead encouraged towards more traditionally feminine careers, such as social services and teaching. The societal pressure to abide by these gender roles perpetuates the power imbalance that is a defining characteristic of America's patriarchy, especially because the roles that are traditionally feminine, like teaching or social services, are significantly less lucrative than the roles that men are encouraged to pursue.
All right. Is that all? May I go now?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. Thank you. All right. So, yeah. So, Marielle, want to make sure I get that right. You bring up a lot of interesting points, but there are things you overlooked. Like you said at the beginning, these rules aren't enforced by the government or regulations or rules. And in the Oxford Dictionary, I want to make sure I'm getting the full wording here. System of society or government in which the father or eldest male is head of the family and descent is traced through the male line. And then below that in bullet points, a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it, and a society or community organized along patriarchal lines. So the issue with that, and reading into the current imbalances in our system right now, as and seeing them as because of some kind of inherent gender imbalance forced by either men or women, is that there are specific personality traits that have been studied across different societies, and it's concluded that men and women are strikingly different in those regards. So, for example, in one instance, Marielle cited a case where men interrupted their female colleagues more. That said, however, that's just an inherent trait, and although not good nor bad, studies have shown that men are more assertive on average, and so that would account for it. And these are just inherent characteristics. And I can go down the list and cite these examples, but a lot of these imbalances or inequities that we see can be simplified to just being as a result of these inherent personality differences. And so that's a big thing here is, in order for a patriarchal system to exist, the first thing is, yeah, it has to be enforced. But we currently see no laws or regulations enforcing it. And so that's really what it comes down to, is although there are inherent inequities, and although there is sexism, and I completely agree with anyone on that line, it's wrong to say that that is the result or is part of a patriarchal system. And so that's really why I'm taking the con on this one.
All right. So first of all, you bring up an interesting point with the top version of the Oxford Dictionary saying that the system is traced through patriarchal lines. And while, yes, that is a technicality, you can see that in American society today. For example, women usually take men's last names rather than men taking women's last names. Children, if the woman does not take the last names, usually have the last name with their father. Secondly, you say that men are on average more assertive than women. That is psychologically not the case. That has been seen through how we raise our children in American society. There are plenty of societies that are matriarchal where that is not seen as the case. If you want to talk about the personality differences, you have to look at where those are enforced. Psychologically, women are not less assertive. However, we raise women to be less assertive. And as for it being enforced, that is like saying because there are no laws that specifically enforce racism, which is arguable in and of itself, that racism is not a problem, that systemic racism doesn't exist. That's just categorically untrue. It still very much does. Yes, it is not enforced by the government. The government is not saying, no, you, a woman, cannot run for Congress. However, societally, it is enforced, and it is pressured on young children and teenagers like ourselves and adults to abide by gender norms that do enforce the patriarchy. So if you want to say that by the definition of a legally enforced system, then yes, we do not have a legally enforced patriarchy. However, that is not the definition of a patriarchy. It is a system of society or government, and I'm saying we have a patriarchal society, a system of society where men hold a disproportionately large share of power, and you cannot argue that that is not the case.
Right. Well, I'm not. The issue is really. So when you're looking at it, though, the system. So you first start with the personality differences and saying that's enforced. I don't think that's a bad conclusion, but it's been demonstrated time and time again that these personality differences do exist, and that does, if not explain away completely, does account for the power imbalance. And as for there being a power imbalance, it's not necessarily, you cite CEOs being primarily men. Again, women are free to make their own choices, right? So saying that, this is something that is forced onto people. No, in our present society, it's not forced onto people because people have free reign over their decisions. I mean, if you really wanted to say that patriarchy was in existence, you would expect to see a lot fewer females in higher education institutions, but that's simply not the case. Colleges have, a lot more women on average than men. I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but it's somewhere between higher than 50% and 60%. So you're seeing a very high level of women in higher education. You see that as well in education. Women make up the vast majority of teachers. So considering that children do spend so much of their time in school, and considering how many women are in higher education, you can't really say that it's completely enforced through the society and not just through laws.
All right. So first of all, let's just circle back to your point here because I actually have the U.S. National Library of Medicine and National Institutes of Health right here. A study was done that says women, while they do tend to be more warm in the workplace and in society, they are no less assertive than men. They did a study on gender and language used on social media and in the workplace, and they found that there is no actual difference between the level of assertiveness. However, men do subjectively rank themselves as being more assertive, which is unsurprising given the gender norms that are part of our society. Secondly, you say that because women make up are a larger percent of teachers than men, that there is not a power imbalance. However, I would like to once again point out the fact that 44% of Americans say that women are more present in fields like education and social services because they are discouraged from pursuing careers in STEM and politics and business. And these careers also tend to be less lucrative. Teachers and social workers and non-doctor health care workers make much, much less than software engineers or business people. So that right there is a societal way of contributing to this power imbalance. You also say because women are making up a larger portion of higher education, that doesn't indicate a power imbalance. However, higher education is not synonymous with the general workforce and the general society. And as for women being able to pursue positions of power, I never said we couldn't. I mean, look at us. We're both going to the same school. We're both pursuing a career in public policy, essentially. However, despite the fact that women make up at least 50% of the population, I think we actually are a little bit more. There are only 20% of congressional members that are women and 25% of state legislatures. That right there is 75 to 80% of the population that doesn't represent half the population. That right there is a clear power imbalance. So yes, there are no laws. I will concede that. There are no laws saying you cannot run for office if you're a woman. You cannot be a CEO if you're a woman. However, our society does pressure, enforce, through passive means in the ways we raise our children, in the messages we give to women versus men, it does enforce a societal patriarchy because there is a clear power imbalance in our society. And I do not see how you can argue that that is not the case when, as I said before, 20% of Congress is women and 25% of state legislatures are women, even though they make up half the population. Only 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. That is a clear power imbalance. If you want to argue that there are no laws, if you want to argue the legal side of it, sure, I'll agree with you that there are no laws saying that a woman cannot be in any of these positions. However, there is a clear power imbalance that is enforced by the societal pressure we place on children and teenagers and young adults.
Well, you say that there's a lot of pressure for women not to enter the STEM fields and not to enter politics. But just within those two groups, there's been immense work done by many advocates to increase the number of women in those fields. And you're not necessarily seeing that play out. I mean, you are to a certain extent, yes, but given the amount of work, you're still not seeing those gains. So one has to wonder, is this actually something that's being enforced through society, or is it just something that's inherent, whether through natural preferences or through some other, really just your natural preferences?
So, first of all, because, yes, I agree, there's a ton of activism, and obviously we are not at 50-50 equality. There's a few reasons for that. First of all this activism in a political lifespan is relatively recent. The majority of leadership, just because, I mean, look, like Mitch McConnell's in his 80s, Nancy Pelosi is in her 80s. The majority of American leadership is still pretty old. The majority of CEOs, I mean, unless we're counting high tech, but take that out for a minute, are relatively older. The leadership is an older generation that was primarily male dominated, that does have a very, very noticeable power imbalance. So yes, there has been a ton of activism, and no, we suddenly did not magically come to 50-50. However, that's unrealistic. I mean, party leadership is still primarily male dominated, and the group in power is only going to give up power when they're absolutely forced to. So you can't say, oh, but because there's activism and it hasn't panned out, then it's clearly not the fault of society, it's clearly the fault of women. That's just simply not the case. That is a gross straw man.
Well, I do like straw, so maybe I'd be good as a straw man. But no, so but you do see that these inherent differences in character traits do exist between men and women. That's what I'm really getting at here, is because those character traits are overlooked when you look at what women choose to pursue. And no doubt that in the past there's been that high pressure, because I'm not contesting that there has been a patriarchy in the past. But when you look at right now, that simply isn't the case, because you do have women in high positions of power. You have the vice president being a female, and then you have the entire
American history
team for the White House being women. And so you're seeing this throughout society right now, that there's been this rapid shift. And sure, you have all these different factors at play here, but you don't really have a patriarchy in place anymore. It certainly may seem like it, but we just don't, just because we've seen these different factors shift.
All right. So first of all, let me ask you a question. Talking about America in the 1950s or 60s, would you say that then we had a societal patriarchy?
Absolutely. I don't think there's any debate on that.
Okay. However, back then, women could still choose their careers. Women could still choose to go into any career they wanted, technically speaking. So by your logic, it was just because they didn't want to. It was not because of the patriarchy. That is what you're saying right there, is because that there were no laws, regardless of who's making the hiring decisions, regardless of all of that, because there are no laws, there was no patriarchy. However, right now, you just said, correct me if I'm wrong, you just said that America in the 1950s and 60s, we had a patriarchy. So what changed between now and then is what I want to know. What changed between now and then? How can you distinguish it? Because by your logic, since women just choose not to take these positions, despite the fact that that is not the case at all, how is it different? That's what I want to know. How is it different between now and the 1950s and 60s by your logic?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with your argument that there were no laws in place. I mean, you just said that women didn't have equal access to a lot of things, including credit, up until 1960, 1980, 1990. And so there were definitely laws that got in place when it came to money, which definitely does factor into that stuff. So I don't agree with your characterization that there were no laws in place.
But my point is,
that's the workplace. But
that's not what I said. I said that there was no law. You're not listening to what I said. There was no law saying that women can only pursue careers in teaching. There was no law, as far as I'm concerned. If you can find one and prove me wrong, go right ahead. There was no law saying that women can only participate in X, Y, and Z careers.
Well, no, I never said
the reason that women were only in those careers was because they could only get hired in those careers because they were pressured into careers that fit traditional feminine roles, which you still see today. If you look, you can, first of all, if we want to talk subjective and anecdotal arguments here for a second, which I'm really not a fan of, you can find countless articles, you can find countless accounts of women trying to get STEM degrees, trying to get engineering degrees, trying to go into these fields and being harassed by male professors and male classmates and being actively discouraged from pursuing these careers. So it's pretty unfair and quite frankly, irrational to say, okay, an entire gender somehow in our hive mind, we all decided, oh, we only want to be teachers and social workers. And that's why we have this power imbalance, because that's simply not the case. Because by that logic, then no woman would be pursuing higher office. No woman would be pursuing business. And we don't see that. We see women actively doing that. However, there's still a power imbalance. So go ahead.
So a couple things there. You say that there were no laws preventing women from specifically pursuing certain careers or certain levels of leadership. And I'm not saying there were. What I am saying is that there were specific laws that prevented women from having access to the tools or resources that were required to pursue those careers. So you're right in saying that that's not exactly the case, but it gets down to the same thing. And what I'm saying is those obstacles, institutional, systematic obstacles, are not present in today's society, which does make it inherently different. And you talk about how there is societal pressure, but I would argue there's actually counter societal pressure. There's a lot of pressure for women to go into those careers right now. And you are seeing that to a certain extent. And so I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that, all of a sudden women shifted. There were definitely systematic obstacles back there which don't exist now. There were definitely, if not systematic and institutional obstacles, like you say, prejudices that were widespread in every facet of society. And what I'm saying is that's simply not true today. That prejudice is not in existence today, at least not nearly on that spread. On that,
you do realize. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead. I think I made my point.
You do realize you're demonstrating those prejudices right now, though. Like, just making that clear. We'll talk about my other points in a minute, but you do realize you're demonstrating those exact prejudices that you say are not widespread right now.
How so? Because I am perfectly...
You're saying women don't want to pursue these careers. You're saying that women want to pursue social services and education. You're saying the exact things that were essentially the societal norm back then, that it's not that women can't do this. Well, I mean, that was part of it as well back then, but it's that women choose these things. It's that we choose to be homemakers. It's that we choose to be social workers. Well, that's your prejudice. That's a prejudice you are saying doesn't exist anymore, that you are demonstrating right now. Secondly, I agree with you. There's not a systematic patriarchy anymore. However, there's a difference between systematic and systemic. There is still very much a systemic patriarchy, because those institutions that exist long ago, just because they're struck down by laws, doesn't mean that those attitudes and those prejudices and those effects of those institutions just disappear magically overnight. If that was the case, most of America's social issues would be solved, because we've passed laws like the Civil Rights Act. Those issues would have gone away if this were the case. If it was just snapping your fingers, passing a bill that says, nope, you can't do this anymore, you can't be racist, you can't be sexist anymore. If that solved it, then we wouldn't have these issues. We wouldn't see these power imbalances. But because we still do, and because, as you can see, I mean, women in leadership have increased greatly since we've had access to it. As you said, we have our first female vice president. That would not have been possible 20 years ago. That definitely wouldn't have been possible 40 years ago. I mean, if you watch the vice presidential debate between Bush Sr. and, I'm forgetting her name, but the first woman to be nominated for vice president position, he spent the entire time talking down to her, even though she was a congresswoman, referring to her as Mrs., and asking if he needed to explain foreign policy to her. It was incredibly condescending. So we would not have a female vice president 40 years ago. We wouldn't even have had one 20 years ago. It was not possible because of the societal attitudes towards women. However, we have seen that since women have had access to positions of power, and since these attitudes have changed, women have increased in positions of power. However, your argument that these prejudices don't exist while you are demonstrating them at this exact moment is both hypocritical and untrue, because they still do.
Well, I contest your argument that I'm demonstrating these prejudices. I harbor no prejudices, and the science does bear me out on this. The number
what
of
science?
Studies,
Show me. Pull up a study right now from an accredited source, one that has not been debunked, because there are a lot of studies that say that stuff, but those studies are generally from like 20 to 40 years ago, and they've since then been disproven. Because what I'm seeing, if you look at the National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health, is that women have been found to be no less assertive than men. I have found no study that has not been debunked or disproven that says women choose more passive roles, that women are just naturally less assertive, that we are naturally less anything than men. Now, are there societal pressures on us for us to be? Yes. Girls, if you look in school, girls are told they're bossy when they're even remotely assertive, whereas boys are congratulated for being a leader and showing real leadership potential. So again, if you can find a study with legitimate statistics and evidence that has not been disproven to show me that biologically speaking, psychologically speaking, I am less assertive than you, and that every other woman is less assertive than you, a man, your argument doesn't hold up, and all you are demonstrating is prejudice. Because so far you have presented absolutely no science. You have just said the science backs me up, and until you present actual science, it doesn't.
Right. Completely fair. So that's why I've pulled up this article. This is from the Scientific American. I think we can all agree that the Scientific American is generally a good source, right? Mm-hmm. and although this isn't a study, it's an article compiling the results of different studies, and of course it has links to those studies. So, it's important to note that when you look at characteristics as a whole, there are two types: broad, more specific. Broadly, you don't see those differences. You're right, you don't see those differences on broad scales because the distinct differences within those broad scales cancel each other out. And keep in mind, these are on average, so these do not apply. There are definitely women and men who display more feminine or masculine characteristics. But the studies have, but when we look down at those specifics, we see certain things on average that appear. For example, on average, males tend to be more dominant, assertive, risk-prone, thrill-seeking, tough-minded, emotionally stable, utilitarian, and open to abstract ideas. And keep in mind, this is on average. This is not every single woman or man who abides by these characteristics. And on average, women tend to be more sociable, sensitive, warm, compassionate, polite, anxious, self-doubting, and open to aesthetics. Now, you may say that these characteristics, these specific characteristics, are influenced by society. But due to the amount of research we've seen in this across different societies, you really can't say that it's completely influenced by society. It is genetic, at least in part.
Okay, so couple questions. First of all, you say that there's no difference between broad characteristics. That is what you said at the beginning, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and since we're talking on a societal scale, so not individuals, because I agree that like there are women, especially, I mean, one, because of societal pressure, and two, because yes, we are wired to give birth. There's a reason there's maternal and paternal energy and maternal and paternal traits. Not going to argue there. You said that it was on a broad scale, that there are no differences on a broad scale, correct?
Well, no, that's not exactly what I said. When you look at the broad traits, the individual differences within those traits cancel each other out. So yes, but I just want to be clear exactly what I was saying.
Okay. So we're arguing, just to clarify here, that American society, which I think we can both agree is a pretty broad bubble, is or is not a patriarchy, right?
Yes.
And you're saying on a broad scale, on a broad level, there is no difference between men and women in traits. There's no broad difference. There's no saying,
no, that's not what I was saying.
Okay, what
broad
were you saying then?
Versus specific traits. For example, in a broad level trait, what you'd be looking at is extroversion, neuroticism, and agreeableness. These are broad character traits that are encompassing of specific ones, including dominance, social ability, stuff like that. And by broad, I mean characteristic traits that are inherently broad, not broad as in encompassing large numbers of people.
So you're saying within broad traits, there are like individual specific traits that there are differences, correct?
Correct.
But there's no difference in the broad traits.
Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. The broad traits are only traits that we group these individual traits under to make it easier to handle.
But you just said that this article in the Scientific American, unless you are changing what the article says, which I really don't think you are, you just said that they're on average, or whatever distinguishing measure we're using, with broad traits, there was no distinguishable difference between men and women with the broad traits, correct?
Yes, but that doesn't discount what the individual traits account for. For example, just because on agreeableness, say this data doesn't show their differences, when you look at individual facets of that broad trait that do come into play in different workplaces, you're going to see those differences arise.
Okay. When was this article published?
This article was published on December 12th, 2019.
Okay. So my point here, well, like, yes, you can say that men and women express traits differently. That's fine. I'm not going to disagree with you there. When you say that in the broad categories of traits, not the individual ones, Within the broad category, there is no difference, right? That is what you have said repeatedly, correct?
Yes.
So men are no less or no more agreeable than women, right?
Well,
That's one of the traits you mentioned as a broad trait.
yes, but that isn't really looking at detailed enough. For example, there are many times where things cancel each other out, but that doesn't negate the fact that when you look at specific traits, those traits are either higher in women or higher in men.
Okay, so you did say men were more emotionally stable than women, correct? That was one of them? Just
Yeah.
checking. Okay, so if that's the case and it's completely genetic, it's not at all societal. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, men have higher rates of suicide, 3.7 times higher specifically, because they are less likely than women to seek help. So you're
Right.
saying that this is completely genetic. So by your logic, men would just be more genetically prone to that, which is completely ridiculous and completely illogical and unscientific to say.
Well, no,
Right?
not exactly. Because just because somebody is less likely to seek help, and actually because somebody is less likely to seek help, that would pair into the fact that externally they're more emotionally stable. And so even if on average people are more emotionally stable, if for some reason that individual has an instance where they're not emotionally stable, you could actually argue that a higher rate of emotional stability across the board would factor into an inability to cope with emotional instability, which would be
Okay.
genetic, yes. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything about it. That's a completely different argument.
So
But
let's
that doesn't factor into whether that is emotionally, not emotionally, but one that's inevitable.
Okay, so let's get back on topic because right now we're arguing about psychology and that's not what this debate is. The debate is whether there's a patriarchy. And the key defining characteristic of a patriarchy, which I think we can both agree, is a power imbalance between men and women, where men hold the majority of power and women do not. Correct? A societal or government
Correct.
system, whichever. Correct?
Correct. That is the definition of patriarchy.
Okay. And in American society, regardless of the cause, do women hold less power than men?
Well,
It's a very simple question. No, it's a very simple question. Do women hold less power than men? Do we hold less political office? Do we, on average, make less in the same positions? Do we experience more discrimination based on gender? It's actually a very simple question, yes or no. And I presented you with plenty of statistics that point to the affirmative that it does.
No, but that's ignoring critical facets of what power looks like in a society. For example, women make most of the consumer decisions within a household. And considering the amount of money U.S. consumers spend, you are going to see that become a significant power source. Women also make up 50% of the population. Like you said, there are no instances of women being denied the right of vote, at least now. In the past, yes, but at least now, no. And so the fact that women make up 50% of the population, even slightly more, is what you said. We should see a lot more female representatives and politicians, but we don't.
Exactly. So again, we're not debating the causes of patriarchy because that's a whole other debate. We're debating its existence, right? I mean, that's what the title of this debate is. Does the patriarchy exist? I'm reading it right off my screen.
Yeah.
How can you say that there's not a power imbalance when, like you just said, you confirmed my point that women make up half, if not a teeny bit more of the population? How then can you say, knowing that, and knowing that they make up less than half of Congress, than half of state legislatures, only 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs, all these positions that I think we can both agree traditionally hold power in society, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure we both agree that people in Congress, they have a lot of power. They're the leaders essentially making the laws. How then can you say that there's not a disproportionate accumulation of power in the hands of men rather than women? How can you say that there's not a power imbalance? Because you still haven't actually said that, you still haven't actually pointed out a flaw there, because you really can't, because the statistics show that women are in less positions of power than men. And the key defining characteristic, as I said before, is a power imbalance between men and women. So how can you say that there is not that power imbalance? We can argue about the causes of the patriarchy. That's a whole other debate, but that's not what this debate is. The purpose of this debate is, does it exist? And you have yet to show that there is not a power imbalance.
Right. Well, I'll grant you that, yes, you're right. Women do make up a minority in state legislators and the U.S. Congress, and Senate. I mean, I know Congress people. Anyway, that's just a definition thing. But uh, but you're ignoring the fact that women do exercise enormous control, and by virtue of control power within the market, by being the primary purchasers of goods. They make household decisions on spending. And women also make up 50% or more of the population. And so they also exercise the right to vote. And unless you're saying that those positions in office aren't elected, then you're saying that women are choosing not to elect more people. And it really comes down to, where do you think the source of power lies? I think the source of power lies in the people. And so if the people aren't electing people of a certain characteristic, whether that be race or gender, and right now we're discussing gender, then I would say that's a decision by the people in power, which is everyone.
Okay, so again, you're not really disputing my point that there is a power imbalance. And yes, I 100% agree that the power lies with the people. However, men, for the most part, are still the primary breadwinners in American households. So yes, while women do tend to make more household decisions, I would say that that is still less power, financially speaking, than men if you are earning less. And again, I know you disagree with me on the pay gap, and that's not really the purpose of this debate either. And I 100% agree that power lies with the people. However, less women, I mean, this is my point again, there are less women elected because there are less women running, because the majority of the power is still congregated with men. And party decisions, if the party who controls who gets nomination, essentially, because I don't really think full honesty, it doesn't seem that really the people have much say in who gets nominations. It's very much a my turn, your turn type of situation, as we saw with Hillary Clinton in 2016. If the majority of the people who are in power are men, and there are less women in power than men, and men hold the majority of power, what makes you think that suddenly they would be willing, that they would be 100% encouraging of another group coming in and taking away some of their power? Because that's my point here.
Well,
is that because
power lies with the people? Because if you really believe power lies with the people, and that there is a patriarchy in place, then you would see women, not being allowed the right to vote. But women do have a right to vote, and women make up a considerable portion, half the population. They make up the majority of people who make spending decisions. And so you do see an incredibly high level of power within women. And so it's not completely accurate to say there is a patriarchy in place.
Okay, again, we can dispute where these differences come from all day. You can argue on the basis of genetics. I can argue on the basis of societal pressure. That's a whole other debate that I think would be very fun, in full honesty. However, my point, which you have yet to refute, because again, you really can't, because the statistics back mine up, is that women hold less positions of power in society. Now, yes, fine, women are primary consumers. However, realistically, if the majority of women are not the ones making the laws, that's who makes the laws is a lot more power than who gets to buy the groceries. Full honesty. Further, your argument that because women have the right to vote, we're not at a power disadvantage. Like, I just want how does that make sense? How does that make sense? Just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean that there still aren't obstacles to exercise that right. And the right to vote does not mean that suddenly there's equal power, because as I said, leadership is old in America. I mean, that's another one. Like, look, our president is the oldest in American history. I mean, Biden 2020 all the way, but still. So how is it when the power is congregated with an older generation that is male dominated? Because you agreed with me that in the 50s and 60s, we very much had a patriarchy. How can you argue that, okay, just because women have these rights, suddenly it's not a problem anymore? Because that's the same as arguing that anything that was undone or given to people by a law suddenly solved the problem, when we see that that is very clearly not the case. We see that with racism in America. We see that with, I mean, there haven't been many laws about anti-Semitism, but we see that with anti-Semitism. We see that with any form of discrimination. Yes, there have been laws passed saying, oh, okay, you can't do this anymore, or oh, okay, we're giving you this right now. That doesn't mean that the problem automatically was solved overnight. That just means that there's no longer a legal justification for saying that, oh, you can't do this, or oh, you can only do this, this, and this. So yes, women have the right to vote. I'm not going to dispute you on that. I really look forward to exercising that right. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't a power imbalance in American leadership. That doesn't mean that there isn't a power imbalance in American government. That doesn't mean that there isn't a power imbalance in American society. Since you have yet to refute me on that, well, we can argue about the foundations of the patriarchy all day. We can argue about whether it's justified or unjustified. We can't really argue, or you can't really argue, that it doesn't exist, because there is a clear power imbalance within society and within government. So,
well, I dispute your proposition that there is currently a power. I mean, not entirely, right? I think it's a lot more complicated than that. You're right that a majority of legislators, both, the Congress, the U.S. Congress and state legislators, are composed of men. I'm not disputing that. I never have, and I've openly conceded it to you. So, but what I am arguing is that their power comes from the people, and that women have the right to vote. So therefore, that is not. Therefore, it's not patriarchy, because, frankly speaking, women have a right to do away with it anytime they want, or at least make change. They can vote for women candidates.
I agree with that. And let me clarify one thing very quickly here, because I think this might have got lost in translation. I'm not saying that there are not plenty of American women, or women in American society, who still buy into the patriarchy, because there are, and for whatever those reasons, we can debate those as well, but that's a whole other debate. There are plenty of women who buy into it. I myself am guilty of that sometimes, and I catch myself and I go, ooh, whoops, probably should be thinking that, probably should be saying that, probably should be doing that, because it goes inherently against my values. I'm not saying that women don't buy into it. I'm just saying that it exists. I will concede that there are plenty of American women, that there are plenty of women in general who buy into a patriarchal society, because it's something we've been raised with, because it's ingrained in our genetics, whatever you want to argue. We can have that debate another time. Sounds super fun too. However, it still is a power imbalance, regardless of whether or not women are buying into it. That's the thing that seems to be getting lost in translation here, is that there is still that power imbalance whether or not women are buying into it. That's my point. We can argue about that another time, but my point is that women do buy into it. And I can't really see how that makes a difference, because it is still a power imbalance, whether or not you're saying, oh, women don't buy into it, or women do buy into it. If we have to have activism against something, if we have to have women's marches, if we have to have all these things against the clear power imbalance in society and government, it generally points to the existence of a clear power imbalance in society and government. Otherwise, we'd all be protesting for nothing in the middle of January, which is obviously not the case. So, because you conceded that there's widespread sexism in American society. There's widespread inequality between the sexes. You conceded that earlier. So you conceded that because there is sexism, there is that inequality, that there is a power imbalance. Therefore, there is a patriarchy. If you want to argue based on where it comes from, who buys into it, the psychology behind it, the culture behind it, that's fine. Let's set it up another time. Sounds super duper fun. I'd love to do that. But we're still arguing on its existence, not where it comes from. And so far, you have yet to argue something that shows it doesn't exist. You've argued where it comes from, which is not what we're debating. We're debating whether or not it exists, and you still haven't argued something that shows there isn't a power imbalance, because suddenly there's magical equality everywhere. Suddenly there's not widespread sexism. You haven't argued that that's the case. You haven't actually argued against the power imbalance. So you have yet to actually refute that there is a patriarchy. You've just refuted my opinions on where it comes from and my evidence on where it comes from, and that's fine. You can refute that all you want, because it's a different debate. You have yet to refute whether or not it exists.
Right.
Wait, I'm gonna chime in really quick. I was told that you guys have 45 minutes, or you guys were gonna go to 45 minutes. Is that right? Or
yeah.
I mean,
okay,
we
so
can keep going. I'm happy to keep going in circles.
Yeah, because
I don't
it
know
seems like it's kind
exactly-
of going in circles. It seems like the resolution, there's a bit of sort of contention with the resolution that Jake has. I don't know.
We
But
can
what
put
do you
it
guys
to
want to
a
do? Do you
vote
guys
in the
want
comments.
what do you guys want to do? You guys want to wrap up, or I'm all good with whatever you guys want to do?
I'm
Because it
good.
seems like it's kind of going in circles. So I don't know if you guys
Yeah.
want to.
No, I think it's good to wrap it up here.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Do you guys want to do closing statements, or do you guys just want to clear out
I
here? Because I don't know if that
Or-
was your closing statement, because I wasn't here for the earlier parts.
I mean, I just basically
I-
made a closing statement. So
Yeah, and I think I don't really have anything else to say.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah, that's completely fine though. That's completely fine.
Yeah.
Well, with that being said, thank you so much, Marielle and Jake, for coming on to this.
put it to a vote in the comments.
Discourse.
People watching, see who you agree with more. I'm curious.
I think we had like 20 people here, but
Oh, wow,
I guess
that's
guys,
awesome.
comment down below or put in the
Yeah, let's
chat
see.
what your thoughts are. Well, I think I'm gonna end the stream now, and then we'll have the
Awesome.
chat rolling. You guys can still see it, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
guys.
Thank you,
I
everyone, for
didn't realize
watching.
there's a chat, so this is a complete surprise to me.
Yeah.